Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello. My name is Mary Jo Kane, and Nicole just told me I'm the boss here at the Tucker Center. So please, everyone, take your seats for the last fabulous session of the day. Please take your seats. Thank you.
Okay, when Mary Jo Kane says sit in your seats, she's serious, so. All right, as a little warm-up activity, we're going to do one more drawing. Well, some people are finding their seats. Okay, boy, it's a demanding group. 298-470. 298-470. Anyone? Oh, hurry, claim it. A gift card to Starbucks. We've got one more left. Come on up. And the last but not least, gift card of the night. $298-488. 298-488. Oh. All right. 298-405. 298-406. I'm mixing. I've been mixing. I promise. Digging to the bottom. 298-492. All right. Last winner of the evening. Okay. Congrats. Starbucks. Okay. It is my pleasure to frame up our final event of the evening and of the conference. This great conversation with sport media scholars will feature 3 seminal scholars who have shaped the landscape of sport media research. Mike Messner, Margaret, Carlisle, Duncan, and Mary Jo Kane. This is a special panel for many reasons. First, we had to cajole Margaret out of retirement. And second, we had to convince Mary Jo to come out of sabbatical time to do the panel. And Mike, you're just here in your own free will. Yeah, Starbucks gift card for you. Okay. Oh, yeah. So it's a really special panel. These scholars will discuss a number of current issues, including insights into the persistent patterns of underrepresentation of female athletes that we've been hearing about today, the amount of coverage and continued emphasis on femininity and heterosexuality over athletic competence. This accessible conversation format will be a unique opportunity to hear firsthand how seasoned researchers conceptualize decades of research, discuss their personal and professional experiences, and reflect on the outcomes and the impact of their research, and talk about future directions, illuminating gaps in the sport media research. I can't think of a better way to end and capstone this conference than to hear from these amazing and respected scholars. And by looking around the room after a long day, those people who have stuck around, which is most everyone, I know you agree with me. It's an added bonus that this conversation will be moderated by a rising star in sport media research, whom I will now introduce and invite to the stage, Cheryl Cooky. Cheryl's an assistant professor at Purdue, which when she took the job, I, as a fellow Big Ten colleague, I said, you now work at PU. You know that, right? We're happy to have her. Cheryl has a joint appointment in health and kinesiology and women's studies at Purdue. She received her Ph.D. in sociology and gender studies from USC under Mike Messner. Her research focuses on gender and sport participation and gender in sports media coverage. She's published a number of articles in our most respected journals, as well as several edited book chapters and anthology. She's the co-author, along with Mike Messner, on the new report in sport media that many of you, I'm sure, have read and downloaded, Gender in Televised Sport, News and Highlight Shows over the last 20 years, from '89 to 2009, which Margaret and Mike have been a part of for many years. And it's been downloaded over 3,500 times in 48 states and 68 different countries. So talk about accessible public scholarship is something to be very proud about. So I'm going to invite Cheryl to the stage, and she will introduce our distinguished panelists. Cheryl?
Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here and to introduce the panelists. And I have to say, as a young scholar, it's a pleasure to be up here, and when I found out that I was going to be moderating this panel, I kind of, over email said, I'm not worthy. So these are the scholars that I grew up reading, well, not in preschool, but, in college I grew up, they were very formative in terms of my development as a scholar. So it's a pleasure to introduce our first panelist. Margaret Carlisle Duncan is Professor Emeritus of the Department of Human Movement and Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Professor Duncan has examined portrayals of female athletes and women's sport in the media, as well as depictions of women's bodies and bodily practices. She has co-authored 4 sport media studies commissioned by the Amateur Athletic Foundation of Los Angeles, which is now called LA84. She is a former president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, or NAS, and is a fellow of the National Academy of Kinesiology, the highest academic honor in her field. Mary Jo Kane is a professor and director of the Tucker Center at the University of Minnesota. Professor Kane is an internationally recognized scholar who has published extensively on media representations of female athletes and is also considered one of the nation's leading experts on the social and political implications of Title IX. She's a fellow in the National Academy of Kinesiology, and in 2004 received the Scholar of the Year Award from the Women's Sports Foundation. This award is given to individuals who make a significant research contribution in the areas of women's sports and physical activity. In 2007, she was named as one of the 100 most influential sports educators by the Institute for International Sport. And just recently, the Research Consortium of the American Alliance for Health and Physical Education and Recreation, or AFERD, has selected, Professor Kane to give a keynote address, the Raymond A. Weiss Lecture, next March at their national convention in Boston. And our third and final panelist is Michael Messner. Michael Messner is a professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Southern California. Professor Messner examines the social construction of gender in sport and has published several studies on gender in televised sports, probably more than several, maybe hundreds, but yeah. So he is an author and editor of 11 books and a 2-time winner of the NAS Book Award, so 2-time winner for the first book, Taking the Field, Women, Men in Sports, and a second award for the book, It's All for the Kids, Gender, Families, and Youth Sports. He is a past president of NAS and has served as a consultant to the California Women's Law Center relative to his work on Title IX. In 2007, he was also named one of the 100 most influential sports educators by the Institute for International Sport. And now I'd like to invite the panelists to join me here on the stage.
I'd like to say something before we begin. I know that Nicole thanked all of the Tucker Center staff and graduate students for all the fabulous work they did. But you need to know that when Nicole approached me with this whole idea about 8 months ago, the first thing I said to her was, fabulous idea, I'm on sabbatical, see, don't get me involved. So 99.9% of this day is because of Nicole Lavoie. Let's give her a huge round of applause.
Okay, so what we're going to do is just get the conversation going with some broader discussion questions. And I'm not keeping track of time, Nicole. Okay, so and then towards the end we'll have it open for Q&A and the chime-in. But what I thought would be nice to start off the conversation with just asking each of the panelists to talk about how they got into the area of conducting research on sport media, and what sparked their interest in doing research in that particular area.
Oh, should I begin?
Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, I don't think my story is very typical when it comes to people who ended up as... Oh, okay, sorry. Let's move it closer. Okay. I was saying I don't think my story is very typical, and that I kind of got into sport media depictions of female athletes and women's sports and a number of other areas by sort of going toward it sideways. It was very difficult for me to figure out what to say about this, because in some respects I don't really know how I got interested in this area. But I can tell you a few things about my background as a child and an adolescent that I think might shed some light on that. Part of it was my family influence. My parents were always very avid readers, and they subscribed to two newspapers, Time, Life, Newsweek. And so I kind of grew up in this milieu of people asking questions, my parents asking questions about why things should be that way or this way. They were kind of eggheads, and I think some of that probably rubbed off on me a little bit. So I think that sort of environment just sort of made me interested in words and the power of words. And how they compel and how they persuade people of certain things, although if you had asked me that in high school, I never would have come up with that kind of an explanation. The second part had to do with my high school English teacher, who demanded that we do very close textual readings in whatever we were reading, poetry, novels, didn't matter what. And at first, I found it extraordinarily difficult to try to deconstruct a poem or another text. But then after a while, I kind of got it, and I got better at it, and I felt like I was a detective on the search for clues and meanings. And that really was what led me then in college to become an English major. Because words and their meanings were sort of paramount there. At the same time I was doing this stuff with reading and texts, I also was kind of following a parallel track which had to do with women's studies, feminism, the women's movement. I read all the classics, The Bell Jar, The Awakening, The Feminine Mystique, all books I'm sure you're familiar with. And these books really resonated with my own experience because I grew up in the South, and at the time that I was growing up, there was sort of the Southern womanhood ideal. And I grew up feeling really depressed and oppressed by that. In fact, a lot of my time as a middle school kid was sort of bashing my head against a concrete wall because I thought things were unfair, and I hated it that boys could do things that I couldn't do. And I just became aware of this sort of double standard of behavior, and it made me so angry. I was seething with resentment for years. And so this is sort of the personal meaning part for me. Let's see, what else? I guess this all sort of came together, and when it came to choosing a particular graduate school, I wanted to apply my detective skills in an area that I would find really challenging, and I wanted to understand the symbolism and the underlying meanings of stories of different kinds. So sort of, I conceive of it as sort of these two parallel tracks that eventually came together. And then, you know, I sort of discovered that sports sociologists who were interested in issues of justice and equity were doing this kinds of work, and that I was very interested in the gender part of it, and also interested in the media part of it, partly because no one had done a lot of research at that time. This is back in 1985. Of course, lots has been done since then. So one more observation. I saw that a lot of people who were who seemed to take televised sport and commentary at face value. And when I suggested to people that there might be something more about it than that, you know, that there might be some other ideologies, discourses sort of circulating, they usually became really hostile and defensive, which led me to believe that there was something larger at stake in this case. So that's my long-winded history.
I guess, like Margaret, I don't think I got into doing sport media research. Well, I'd say I guess I came at it sideways, but maybe from another side. And it's probably more from being, I did have a background in sports, but it was more from beginning to have a sort of theoretical perspective about the dynamics of gender in society. And when I was in graduate school, I started doing research on gender and then eventually did a dissertation on gender and sport, masculinity in sport. And the theoretical work that I was doing at that time, this is also in the mid-'80s, was led me to the sort of tentative and analytical conclusion that the female athlete was what I called a contested ideological terrain, that it was the whole imagery of women athletes at that time, because we're like, you know, a decade or so after Title IX, there's been this surge of women athletes out there. So no longer were we living in the same world where we had in the post-World War II era that I grew up in, 1950s, early 60s, sports for men, cheerleading for women, and even though there were some girls playing sports, you certainly didn't know much about them at the time. But there had been this incredible surge of female athleticism by the early 1980s. So I was starting to think, you know, one of the key questions that could be asked is, what does this mean? How is this going to change society or not? So I was always really interested in sport. Not so much as sports sociology as a kind of contained academic field where we're all going to kind of look inside sport and see what's happening, but more sport and society. How does sport connect to other aspects of society, families, political systems, dominant ideologies of gender? So that led me to start thinking about how is the media handling this surge of female athleticism. And it was around a little bit after I finished my Ph.D. and I got to LA, I ran into Margaret Duncan at a conference at the Amateur Athletic Foundation.
Yes.
And they were having a conference where they were showing these videos of clips to a bunch of media people. There weren't many academics there. It was mostly media people that they had invited. They were showing all these media clips of egregiously racist and sexist sorts of sports commentary. And a lot of the media people responded very defensively. You know, that's not really what we do. You cherry picked that. That's the worst kind of thing. It's anecdotal. And so Margaret and I actually just walked up to them and said, do you want somebody to do some systematic research? Maybe they'll believe you next time then. And so they basically hired us to start doing research, and that was the beginning of the studies that we continued every 5 years for several years, and the last of which Cheryl did with me. So I think the impetus for me was, and the driving force was, and continues to be, I think, a theoretical / political sort of project of trying to understand the importance of imagery and the importance of media discourse and how that fits into shifting belief systems about gender. And I still think that imagery of women athletes and spoken word about women athletes is one of the most important. It's not the most important, I would say, but it's a very, very important part of the overall picture of how gender is being constructed in this day and age. And that's partly, I think, because of the centrality of the body in sport. You simply cannot ignore bodies in sport in ways that you can in other areas of social life. So I think that's one of the things that makes sports so crucial and so important for us to understand and study and critically interrogate.
Well, both as Mike and Margaret said, I mean, I didn't sort of consciously set out to get my PhD and do work on sport and media and gender, but thinking about this in terms of the question that Nicole posed, my father owned an advertising agency, and so I saw from a very early age the issue of the creative process, or tortured process, in trying to tell a story with words and images and what we in the academy would call narratives and counter-narratives, although that's not what they talked about. So that interested me. And I have always been fundamentally interested in the issue of power, and especially power within large institutions and organizations from a sociological perspective, how it's amassed and projected, but also how it's contested by marginalized groups and the strategies that are used by both groups over this contest of power. And to me, if there's any large institution in this culture where we can see that contest playing out, is within the ubiquitous mass media. And so that interested me a lot. And then finally, I've always really loved sports. I'm an enormous consumer of sports. Speaking of institutions where power is projected and contested in this culture writ large. So for me, in that sense, it was just sort of a natural to look at the intersections of sport, media, and gender. And then also, I have to say, being a graduate student at the University of Illinois and working with people like Susan Greendorfer and John Loy, and being aware of the work of these two people to my right. I would read their work and I'd think, wow, that's really good. Wow, that's really interesting. But you missed this part, so now I'm gonna do that part. And so that's how I got into it.
Thank you. So I think it's interesting because earlier in the day we were sort of talking about the importance of these sorts of gatherings, and I think the Coaching Alliance for Women's Coaches, I'm sorry, I'm not getting the name right. Alliance of Women Coaches, that you two came together at a conference and decided that this was something important, and it's interesting that in some ways those connections are, Margaret and Mike, it seems like your research on the televised sports really kind of generated from those sorts of conversations at conferences. So kind of interesting connection there. And I find it interesting as well that you all came to this in sort of an accidental kind of way, or a sideways sort of way, and much different than maybe graduate students today, that you guys were really the path makers for us, and so now graduate students and young scholars, we know we want to do this research. So I think that's one contribution that you've made to scholars, but what do you see as the most important contribution of your work, either related to the implications of your studies, or however you want to speak to that issue?
Well, I've thought about this a lot too, and I don't think of any particular study that I did, but more in terms of kind of an arc or the progression of my research. And what I can say, and I want to just spend a little bit of time about this, because again, I thought about this a lot, is that what I can say is that for me, what was early in my career by far the most important work that had an enormously impactful result on me was a work I did with my colleague Lisa Dish, who is now a political scientist at the University of Michigan. And it's an article that we wrote on Lisa Olson, who was sexually harassed in the locker room of the New England Patriots in the early 90s. And let me tell you how it had an impact on me. I remember, first of all, it created a huge media firestorm. Lisa Olson was one of the very first female beat reporters to cover and to go into the locker room of men's professional football. And she was sexually harassed by several of the players who surrounded her naked and stuck their penises in her face and basically said, in effect, "Do you want a piece of this?" and called her a dick-watching bitch. And this created this, as I said, enormous firestorm of what the Lisa Olson incident meant. And at the time that this happened, I was at NASM, which is the Sport Management Conference, and there was a huge buzz about it. And I remember sitting in the audience and hearing one of the people say that this was a terrible thing to have happened, which of course it was. It was a terrible PR blunder and problem for the Patriots, for the league, for men's football. And I remembered sitting there thinking, and his point was, no one benefits from what just happened. And I remembered thinking, that's a terrible analysis. Because in fact, men benefit, and especially male reporters and editors benefit when female reporters are sexually harassed in locker rooms. And again, think about this, it's 1993. So I came back from NASM and I talked to my colleague Lisa Dish, and I said, let's do a media critique of how this whole thing is playing out. And so we independently looked at, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, the Standard kind of stuff. We even got access to the Heyman report, which was the official report of the NFL's investigation. And we independently analyzed these media narratives. And what we were interested in is speaking of the notion of contested terrain, and we looked at what male reporters and editors were saying about it, what female reporters and editors were saying about it, what the NFL brass was saying about it, and what the players were saying about it, to see if there were different narratives and counter-narratives of what this all meant. And, I'm not going to go into what we found, but here's the important thing about the impact that it had on me. It got some local press. And if my memory serves, there was a woman who was a sports editor at the St. Paul Pioneer Press then named Glenda Holste. And that year, Awesome was having their annual convention in Minneapolis. And so she contacted me and asked me if Lisa Dish and I would, because she had read our paper, and said, would you give the keynote to at this conference? And I said, sure, okay, fine, we've done this before. Somehow somebody sent Lisa Olson, who at the time had exiled herself to Australia, and she read the article. And it was announced publicly the day before we were to give our talk that Lisa Olson was coming to the conference.
Wow.
And so we had reporters, national and local reporters there as well. Okay, so fast forward. Lisa Dish, my collaborator, and I are in the bathroom 3 minutes before we're supposed to go on. We know each other well, and she looks over at me, and I'm sure I looked ashen. And she said, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "Well, we got a problem," because I was going first. She said, "What's the problem?" I said, "Well, here's the deal, Lisa Dish. We go to conferences and we present our research all the time, and then as soon as we're done, you remember the good old days, our colleagues, pounce and eviscerate, and that's okay because, they don't know any more about what they're talking about than we do. So that's okay. But what we're about to do is to walk into a room of women reporters. Now remember, we didn't interview any reporters. We didn't interview any NFL players. Neither of us have ever been in a men's locker room. We did an analysis of media. And we're about to walk into a room full of 150 women, of the very reporters that we're about to say, this is what it means for a female reporter to be in men's locker rooms, and this is what the Lisa Olson story meant, and Lisa Olson's going to be sitting there. So we're screwed. And she looked at me kind of like a coach, and she was like, "Get a hold of yourself." She said, "Here's the thing to remember. Even if they don't agree with us, Mary Jo, our analysis is correct." We nailed the analysis. And I said, "You're right, we did." So we go out, and it was almost as if it was this revival meeting, because as we got through our study, more and more I could feel the electricity in the room of these women reporters who had never really heard anybody talk about their experiences like this with an analysis and a critique. And they were totally supportive, and I don't think we got a standing ovation. Maybe in my mind we did. But I know that it was very, very well received. And afterwards, people come up to you and say, you were great, whatever. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lisa Olson approach me. And she said, "I have one thing to say to you." And I said, "Okay." And she said, with tears in her eyes, "Thank you." And I said, "You're welcome." And from that moment on, I was always very aware of what kind of research I would do and what kind of impact it would have on the lives of people, and to make connections with organizations and individuals like Awesome to get our work out there. So that's my story about how research very early in my career has stayed with me, and I've never actually told that story out loud. So thanks to Lisa Olson.
Well, that's a great story, and it is also a great article. So, if you haven't read that article, that should be part of your reading list, because it's just really a classic, great example of media analysis. How would I assess what my most important contributions have been in this field? I'm not really sure, but I guess in thinking about this, I thought of two things. If you've done work that in some way stimulates or continues critical conversations, then your work has had an impact. And I could think of two things that I would mention that I think have had that kind of impact. One is a piece that I did a number of years ago with my colleague Bill Solomon. Is a case study of one media story of when the boxer Sugar Ray Leonard was, it came to light that he had beaten up his wife and told her he was going to kill her and done a lot of awful things to her, and it came to light that he had been using drugs and drinking quite a bit. And we traced that story and watched what happened to it, and I won't reiterate that for you. And in fact, I did present it at a conference, and Sugar Ray Leonard was not there, so that's probably a relief. But not so much to reiterate the story, but in terms of a kind of scholarly academic template, a lot of people, including some of my former students like Sherry Dworkin and Faye Wax, Cheryl Cooky, have used some of the same sort of framework of thinking about how media stories kind of play out in terms of narratives of sin and redemption, and how news packages or news frames get applied to certain stories, and it's important to ask the question, what's outside the frame? How are stories, how are reporters, and editors making decisions about what goes inside the frame and what's left outside? How might the frame move over time so that parts of the story get lost? And I think that kind of frame analysis, which is not something I made up. I've found that elsewhere in media research, but I think in sports sociology, sport media research, it's something that I might have kind of imported into sport media research. And then the other thing is just this longitudinal study that I did so many years with Margaret and now with Cheryl. In many ways, this kind of research of doing essentially content analysis / textual analysis on televised news shows and highlights shows. We do 3 network affiliate news shows, and we do ESPN Sports Center. MSPN is what it is, actually, not WSPN, ESPN, MESPN. It's in some ways simple research, and I say that with all due respect to everyone who's been a research assistant on the project and had to look through all the tape, including you once, Cheryl, when you were a graduate student, but that it's time-consuming. But it's kind of simple research in a lot of ways, but in terms of the kind of impact that research can have, especially if it's longitudinal and you can show change or lack of change over time, it's very powerful and very useful. For advocacy groups, it's very useful for teachers, and a couple of people just here today have told me that they've used the most recent one in their classes with their students. And so it's extremely gratifying to do research that people who are trying to make change in the world, whether it's in the classroom or through advocacy work with organizations where girls and women in sport, or people who are teaching the journalists of tomorrow and using the report in J schools. It's very, very gratifying to have people say that they're using the work and that it's having an impact and helping them. So those are the 2 things that I would note, I think.
Well, Mike sort of stole my thunder here. I'm going to talk about some sort of a general, I guess, contribution, and then I'm going to move to a more specific contribution. But let me start with the AAF studies, just to sort of build on what you said. One of the things that I thought was most useful in the AAF studies was after we completed the study, it was published by the foundation. It was sent out to major networks, cable networks, anyone who was publicly involved in presenting sport. And I really think that made a difference, at least I hope it did, but it seems that there are some indications that it did, change the quality of the sports writing and the sports commentary. And one example that I would use is the example of Fred Rogan. Is it Rogan?
Yeah. Rogan.
Fred Rogan. If you live in LA or any place probably in Southern California, you would know the kind of person he is. He does the sports. He has a wicked sense of humor, and it's often directed at female athletes, or at least it used to be when we first started. So we made a special attempt to send him a copy of our AAF report, and I have noticed some changes in his reporting, which I assume affect his audience as well as TV audience. One of the things that he does, and he does it so well, is to make his pronouncements about female athletes and women's sports incredibly funny, if you're not a woman, incredibly funny. And so, for example, I remember in the early days, one of the things he did, one of his little highlights of the news commentary happened to be an episode, not an episode, but a short clip of nuns in habits playing beach volleyball. And that was the only coverage that he'd given that day to women. That was it. Everything else was about men. Then, one of our, I can't remember which study it was, but maybe the second to the last one, Fred Rogan was showing, he was talking about the LPGA, and he said, some of you have been calling in to say we really would like to have increased coverage on the LPGA. Your command is my wish, or he didn't put it quite like that, but we're trying to respond to that interest in women athletes. So here it is. I doubt very much he would have done that, 10, 15 years ago? Yeah, so it seemed to me that that's sort of a concrete demonstration of the kind of contribution that the AAF research did. And in other respects, I guess I could talk a little bit about my favorite article. I don't know how much impact it had on anyone, actually, but it's always hard to kind of figure these things out. I did a study, this was in 1990, I think it came out, on sports photographs and the 84 and 88 Olympics. And what happened was, I realized that there's a whole vocabulary and a set of framework in which you can analyze visuals. And no one had really done much with that before. So it required me to sort of go across to other disciplines and read all I could about the impact of photographs. So I read things like Susan Sontag's On Photography and John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and then some articles in other areas like media and communication. And what I ended up doing was sort of building up a framework for analyzing photographs, and came up with a number of categories like things that you could look at that might be telling or significant. In photos, the facial expressions of athletes, whether they were crying or not, whether they were posed for a picture or they were actually in action. What else? Angle, lightings. Even one thing that I discovered that was very upsetting to me was that a number of the sports writers who were now covering sports had been previously photographing the swimsuit issue, the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. And they used the same conventions, which are basically conventions of softcore porn, when they were presenting pictures of female athletes in Sports Illustrated, say. So that that really surprised me, but I thought, this is something that needs to be done. It's a natural complement to strictly written textual analysis. And I noticed afterwards that a number of other people were interested also in analyzing the visuals. So I think that had at least some impact in our field. I'm not sure if it had any impact outside the field, but that's one of the, I think, most original things that I've done. So
Can I go slightly off script here to talk about their contributions on those two articles? Okay. Here, I want to place this in context because you have to realize the generation that we are as scholars. We were
called seasoned a while ago.
right,
I think.
seasoned. We came out of programs that said that quantitative research was the only thing that mattered. And to go back to my Lisa Olson piece, one of the reviewers was an outright reject. Wow. But here's what basically they said. Fabulously written, incredibly interesting, needs to be in the New Yorker or as an expose in the New York Times. It has absolutely nothing to do with research and doesn't belong in a research article because you didn't talk to anybody. You just read magazine articles. I then called Peter Donnelly and said, "Are you kidding me? What?" And he was like, "Take it easy and don't worry about it." Anyway, here's the point. Because of that particular article and also Mike's article on the post-Title IX female athlete as contested ideological terrain, they provided people like me and Jane and others who are shaking their heads with fabulous theory and incredible methodology that gave critical discourse analysis around media texts credibility and started to blow open the doors to get this kind of research published and recognized. So that's just all I want to say. Sorry.
You're good.
No, that's all right.
No, that was
I'm glad
great.
you said
Thank
that.
you. Oh, did you?
No, I was just saying I'm really glad that Mary Jo mentioned that.
Yeah.
It's true.
It's true. It is.
So in terms of the impact of the research, what do you feel is the most important thing either you've learned from the research that you've done or that you feel that the field has learned?
Shall I start? I think some of that question has already been answered. Probably, what was the second question was, what is our most important contribution? So I don't really think I have anything to add to that. Okay. Yeah.
What's the most important thing you've learned, Professor Messner?
I'll just tag on something quick on that because I think I kind of answered the question for myself already too, but I think one of the important things I've learned is that systematic research can have an impact, and you can make that part of academic discourse and public discourse, and that is a very empowering message, I think, for all of us who are doing academic research, is that we can do research that's academically sound and solid and can have some impact and can be useful to advocacy groups and organizations.
Can I add to what I just said? I realize I do have something else to say. And I'll just mainly talk about the most important thing that I learned from this research that I then shared with my students, because that's, of course, one really good way to broaden the impact of what you're doing. And for me, it was the way that power relations are encoded in language and, of course, in photos, and that discourse really has a profound influence on the way that we think about gender, race, sexuality, class, age, ability, and disability. And one metaphor that I think is really enlightening is one that Nancy Henley used when she called language, in fact, I think I have her exact words. She talked about the gun that points backward. And what this means is, in language, the gun is loaded. And in our case, when we're talking about gender, but also other power relations, what happens is the gun, instead of, sort of making its point, comes back then to haunt women and to make them seem inferior, even if they're using the same language and they're using it for their own empowerment. Because what happens with this gun, language is the gun that shoots backwards, is that basically it marginalizes certain people, all different kinds of groups, you know, anything you could think of. And so, for example, just to give you one concrete example, because I think you probably need that, is a good way that discourse or language undercuts marginalized groups, and I'll take the subject of gender, is actually we did quite a few things on in the AAF report. We talked about the naming of collegiate athletes teams or athletic teams. We talked about, for example, there's the Tigers, that's the men's, and the Tigerettes for the women. And there's something about wild kittens instead of wild cats. And the teddy bears instead of the bears. And those are the kinds of things that really, I think, exemplify the gun that misfires, that shoots backwards. Because every time someone says something like that, it's creating an impression of weakness, impotence, lack of power. And so I think that particular idea really stuck with me. And so I always wanted to see, I always searched for the gun that points backwards when I was doing my textual analysis.
I want to add one thing to that too. So
Sure,
we're gonna-
go ahead.
I just wanted to say one thing that working over the years with Margaret that I learned, you know, having been educated more in the social sciences, is looking to interdisciplinary colleagues to give you ideas. And Margaret, I thought, was very good at always importing ideas from other disciplines, and especially in the humanities, in terms of her textual analysis. And while I was doing one of these first studies with Margaret, I think I was reading for the first time the great working class socialist feminist author Tilly Olson, who wrote about unnatural silences. And as I was looking at this sports media and thinking, where are the women? I thought, this is an unnatural silence. And Tilly Olson was talking about the silence of women's voices historically in literature. But we were able to deploy that idea of unnatural silences to think about what's missing outside the frame for women and the coverage of women. So I think, you know, using works from and metaphors from the humanities, I think, is something that will really broaden and loosen up what I think sometimes in the social sciences we tend to be constricted and put into straitjackets by our methods too often, and not kind of thinking a little bit more creatively.
Some of the important things that I've learned from my research, but I think we've also sort of bled into what impact it's had on the public discourse, is that kind of what I learned is keep it simple, which we're not at all trained to do, of course. I think it's really critical that we ask interesting, important questions that, if designed properly with hard work on the front end, I'm looking over at my graduate students, and I say to them, taking it to my grave, I don't want to hear about your method, I want to, what's the question? Everything should spring from that. And you do the hard work on the front end so that your data and your critique can be replicated and stand the test of time. I think if you do that, you're going to be able to influence a broader audience and the next generation of students. And in terms of doing what, you know, Mike and Margaret have referred to as simple research, and I know that's not what you mean around the longitudinal media work, I can't tell you the number of times when I'm talking to reporters and I make two simple points that you can just hear the light bulb go off on the other end of the phone. And I say, in the post-Title IX era, 40% of all participants in sports and 42% of all intercollegiate scholarship athletes are female. 2 to 4% of all sports media coverage cover women's sports. And they grab onto that and say, really, where's that study? Where's that? Because it is so simple and yet unbelievably profound and impactful. And so, you know, I urge people to think about that kind of work. In terms of whether or not the kind of work that sport media scholarship, which is what, 30, 35 years old, has done, almost entirely by sports sociologists, is that we are connecting our research that tells a story to a broader audience, and I think it has made an enormous difference. I know it has. Speaking of the Minnesota Lynx winning, not just winning, sweeping, crushing, which is important to point out. The new president of the WNBA and their vice president for marketing were here in Minneapolis for the first game, and they asked to meet with Nicole and me because they were aware of the work that we did around media representations in the Tucker Center, and they wanted to talk to us about how they might prepare promotional campaigns. And it's like, are you kidding me? Nobody cares about what we say. But they do, and it's incredible. And speaking of ESPNW, Nicole and I have been involved with them from the beginning, and I have worked with some of the ESPN folks. And if you chart the coverage of how ESPN covers women's March Madness and Final Four from 10 to 15 years ago to today, it is unbelievably different. And I think that's because there has been, they get it. And I think that's because folks like the three of us do research that reporters are interested in, and it can be translated into English and have an enormous impact on a much broader audience. Mm-hmm. And maybe when we do the Q&A, folks out there can sort of give us some feedback about that.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing, too. I had written this down, and then I sort of forgot about it. But I agree with you, Mary Jo. The notion of this being simple research makes it sound like it's superficial, and that's not the case. I think Mike has a real gift for presenting information in a way that many different kinds of audiences can understand it. And he did actually write almost all of the narratives of the report single-handedly, although, you know, maybe we contributed phrases or something. And I think that's a real skill, and I think we need more people who can do that, because even though, you know, it wasn't, the AF report wasn't written as though it was a sophisticated piece of research, it had very powerful messages that were a part of it, and so I think, yeah.
I think, too, this notion of being, as scholars, public intellectuals. In fact, didn't you do a session at NAS, or somebody organized a session, was it Jay Coakley?
Probably Jay.
About what it meant as a scholar to be a public intellectual. And you get in the Rolodex of reporters, and you return their calls, and you speak to them in ways that they understand. And so you have an opportunity to put your work out there and make an argument or provide a counter-narrative to the narrative that's out there. So you're the person that gets called by the New York Times or the Washington Post or whenever some sort of story breaks. And in terms of totally, utterly shameless self-promotion,
Go ahead.
Don Sabo and I tomorrow at 10 o'clock are on Carrie Miller on Minnesota Public Radio to talk about this conference and the whole issue of sport, gender, and media. So tune in.
Maybe you all feel like you've spoken to this issue, but about the impact of your research on public discourse, is that? did you have anything
Yeah.
you wanted to add to that?
I think we've
Okay.
covered that.
So where do you see what's your current focus? Because you've talked a lot about, what I call kind of the classics, your studies that have had that kind of impact, but what are you working on currently, or where do you see the future of maybe either your own research or future directions for the field, if you want to speak to one or both of those issues?
Well, since I'm retired, right now I'm not working on too much, but I would say within the last 5 years I've become very much more interested in women's body culture, and that I think started through my analyses of women's fitness and beauty magazines. And I use that term intentionally because fitness magazines directed at women are beauty magazines. So moving to women's body culture, one of the issues that has arisen in the news and has been very, the source of many, many headlines, has to do with the so-called obesity epidemic. So what I'm really interested in right now is the sort of discourse that women's fitness and beauty magazines propagate, and how they relate to their dieting and their fitness plans for the readers. I did a study on student discourses and their responses to all the news that was coming out about the obesity epidemic. And I was pretty shocked, actually, because from the very beginning of my teaching at my university, I would have students, introductory students, say things that just curled my hair, that say, and these things all related to people who are overweight or fat. And there's a sort of really judgmental, moralistic current in it, which made me think that probably, this whole notion of an obesity epidemic, is at least partly a moral panic, where people are freaking out over usually a group of people, although occasionally one particular person, and these groups tend to emerge as threats to the status quo, and they tend to be demonized. And fears of their menace are almost always greatly exaggerated by the media. So my first study was to try to see if I could find that moralistic discourse in what students had to say about overweight and fat people. I use the term fat because that's the term that fat people prefer. So obesity, of course, is a biomedical term. Okay, and the second thing I've done, again relating to this body culture, especially the whole issue of fat, has to do with fat memoirs. And fat memoirs are sort of a formulaic approach to autobiographical approach to talking about some issues with growing up fat and the stigma of fat. And basically there are two versions that I discovered. That one has to do with, it's an older formula, which is that I was fat as a child, as fat as an adolescent. By the time I reached adulthood, I suffered all of these terrible negative comments about the way I looked. I girded my loins, and then I lost 150 or 200 pounds. And now my life is perfect. Everything's turned around. I have a successful social life. I'm dating again. I have a better job, and so on. The second version of this kind of memoir is quite different. It's a more politicized version. It starts out the same. I was fat as a child. I had trouble during adolescence. I'm now an adult, and I don't really care what other people think about me. You know, I don't feel that I should be deprived of my civil rights because I'm a fat person, or what you would call a fat person. So I found that really interesting. Again, it doesn't have to do with sport per se, it's more a body culture issue. But reading these politicized memoirs, which are generally, they aren't like scholarly books or anything, they're like Cameron Manheim's Wake Up, I'm Fat, which maybe some of you have heard. Judith Moore, who's a very well-respected writer, wrote an autobiography called Fat Girl. Another woman who had a blog, still has a blog, I think, is Wendy McClure, and she wrote a book called It's Not the New Me. So that's the second thing I've been working on. The last thing that I've been working on is an analysis of the discourse of fitness and beauty magazines about both dieting and losing weight. And I'm interested in this because this is these kinds of magazines are highly accessible, they're very popular, all my students read them. And a key part of it is that there's a lot of diet double talk or exercise double talk. Things like lose weight and sculpt your muscles, but love your body and be confident about it. But if you love your body and you were confident about it, you would never want to lose weight. So that's, it's kind of a duplicitous way of presenting dieting. Lose weight, but you shouldn't really try too hard, and you shouldn't diet. And so every magazine has a diet that they call an anti-diet, or this is not really a diet, it's just making subtle changes in your life. And that's because diets don't work. This is what the magazine says, and you know that every single plan that every month they have something else about diets that do work. And then there are a lot of others, but celebrities have the secret formula for losing weight. And we're going to give it to you in this magazine. Well, obviously, if they do that, it's no longer secret. It's very arcane knowledge. And that this is a diet that's individualized for you and also thousands of other readers. So when you see those kinds of contradictions, I think you have to you have to dig deeper, and you have to try to figure out what's going on, and that's what I've been doing with all of these body culture issues. So.
Well, I'm not currently doing sports media research. I'm doing research on activists against gender-based violence, so none of it media and a little bit of it sport, but not too much. And I suppose when the next 5-year period rolls around, Cheryl and I will crank up the longitudinal study one more time.
Mike, actually, you are doing sport media research.
Yeah, well, I'm the fourth wheel on a study on the Don Imus story that Cheryl and Shari and Faye have.
In the Indiana version of the Gender and Televised Sport Report, yeah.
But
cool.
Thank you. So, okay.
Busted.
I am doing that. I forgot.
See, he's working on so much, he can't keep it all straight. I have to, kind of be the...
It's one of the privileges of being a senior former advisor that you actually get hooked on like a caboose on some of these things, and you end up being the co-author without really having to do a heck of a lot. So it's good work. So I thought if you can get it, yeah. But I did want to say that instead addressing the second half of the question that Cheryl kind of led us to, I think here, which is kind of where I think the field is going and should go, and I think a lot of the research that we up here have done on sports media over the years, and a lot of the research that's been done in the field over the years, is mostly content and textual analysis. And there are really three aspects of sports media research, of any media research, that should be addressed. The first part is production, and like, how do we understand what gets produced and how and why, and what the social relations and economics of production of media are. The middle part is the text, is the visual or written text that we all have studied. And then the final part is the audience, and you know, how do audiences and variously placed people, variously socially located people, interpret and use media. And so I think, to me, that, you know, in terms of that first part, the production, I think, you know, there's been very little of that done in sports media research. And I remember Nancy Thaberge did a really great piece on routines among newspaper workers that really gives you some insights into how stories are created and what gets made into news and how and why. And you know, I would really like to know, for instance, there's a puzzle in my mind in terms of that comes out of the content and textual analysis of ESPN. As Mary Jo mentioned, you know, years ago when Margaret and I first started doing this AAF study, women's NCAA basketball was not on TV, no regular season games. The Final Four maybe would be shown on late night tape delay, but you basically could not see women's basketball on TV. Now, yes indeed, you can see women's basketball on TV. It's not nearly as much as men's basketball, but there are games on. If you got cable, you can find a women's basketball game on just about any weekend. The NCAA tournament, they show lots of games. The production qualities are much higher than they used to be. ESPN does a lot of this, and I think they do it quite well. So I think that's one change that's really, as a basketball fan, I am really happy about. On the other hand, though, this study where we've been tracking ESPN Sports Center for the last few iterations of this study, the coverage of women's sports is lower than ever, and the coverage of women's NCAA basketball is almost non-existent during the time of the NCAA tournament on Sports Center. So I don't get that. I would love to know, I'd love to have a study at the production level of how those decisions are made. And for me, from my point of view, just in terms of a sports marketing, it doesn't make sense that, I mean, they would be, I would think, trying to build audiences for the programs that they're showing. Right. And I think that those highlight shows are one of the most powerful, emotional pieces of the puzzle of building fan interest and sustaining fan knowledge and interest. And to give you one example of that, I wrote about this in a little journalistic piece a year and a half ago or so, I guess. I go to all the USC women's basketball games. I'm a big fan. And I took a friend, some of you in sports sociology circles know Bill Morgan, who's a sport philosopher at USC now. And my son used to go with me all the time, but he couldn't come, so Bill came with me to this great semifinal basketball game of the Pac-10 tournament. USC playing against Oregon, the highest scoring team in the country that year. They ran up and down the court, scored 85 points each or something, and USC won just by a sliver, and it was super exciting, good crowd. And the next day, and Bill hadn't been to a game for a long time, and the next day he wrote me an email and he said, "Mike, that was so fun, I want to go to another one." And he said, "But I got home and I turned on the TV news because I wanted to catch a recap, and it wasn't there. So I went to another station. No, it wasn't on KNBC either. Nobody did anything, and it's right here in LA. It's, you'd think they'd be covering it." And I wrote him back and I said, "No, I'm analyzing the data right now, and they just don't do that, And but I pitch that to my students sometimes. I say, why would it be that after watching the whole game and knowing the score, knowing the outcome, why would it be that a couple hours later he would want to sit in front of a TV and catch a recap on a game where he witnessed it 100%? And it's because, and the students of mine who are sports fans know the answer. It's because sometimes you want to catch a little piece of information on how many points somebody scored, because you don't know that. But more, it's because it's like a drug. You're looking to chase the high, especially if you're team one, of course. You're looking to chase the high, and that gives you just another burst of pleasure and joy to watch the recap of the game that you just watched either on TV or you just witnessed. So what's happening is fans of women's sports are getting robbed of that, and it's not just being robbed of a high. When you think of it as audience building, it's a whole kind of emotional package that all of the media together build to create fans routinely for men's sports. And women's sports, you got to search pretty far. You can go to the internet and get the box score or something like that. So I think the production research is really important. How is it happening that they're showing more play-by-play, but it's not making it into the nightly news, it's not making it into ESPN's Sports Center? And then at the reception end, I think there's a lot of work to be done. Now, I was really happy to see in the session before this one, there's some people doing reception research. The piece on boys' interpretations of images of women athletes and women models, I think, is a really good step in the direction of the kind of research we need that looks at how people interpret these things, because we don't really know that for sure. I mean, we can say what we think it means by analyzing the content, but we know from some of the best media research that I've seen over the years by Darnell Hunt, that looks at audiences. He looked at the O.J. Simpson trial and televised coverage of that, and the L.A. riots, televised coverage of that. These are two different books that he wrote, and he met with focus groups, black and white focus groups, and he came to the conclusion that sort of differently racially situated people view and interpret and make meaning out of those mediated events in very, very different ways in general. So, like, how, that's a good starting point for trying to figure out what do these things mean that we're all so critical of? What do they really mean to consumers? So I think that's the direction that I would encourage people who are doing we need to continue to do the content analysis studies, of course, but really developing a much more textured understanding of the political economy of the media and the production, and then also of the reception and the meanings of various audiences.
Well, in terms of my most recent research focus and going with the next research, which actually addresses what we've just been talking about in terms of the critical gaps, my former Ph.D. student, Heather Maxwell, and I had an article just published, Kane and Maxwell, in the Journal of Sport Management, and it was around this whole issue of, does sexualizing female athletes really increase interest in and respect for women's sports? And the reason that I got interested in this is because, I would literally go around the country with my slide projector and carousel, and now I'm so sophisticated that we do PowerPoints. But in every single time I gave the talk, regardless of the audience, and for those people who agreed with me or did not agree with me, when we got to the question and answer session, there was always the point that tried to sort of stop the discussion, which was, Dr. Kane, I think you're right. I think these images are terrible. But the bottom line is sex sells. And if you want to get butts in the seats, that's what you got to do. And I would always walk away from those things saying, how do we know that? I know that there's no academic research on that. And I looked into the marketing research, and I don't know where you've done studies where you've portrayed females as competent athletes for season X and sexualized them for season Y and then compared attendance ratings. So how do we know that? And I always thought that it was counterintuitive and counterproductive to sexualize female athletes, and I was aware of the fact that the very same people that were saying you gotta sexualize female athletes were also saying nobody ever goes to see women play sports. Have you noticed that? I mean, seriously. So Heather and I designed a study of focus groups of 18 to 34-year-old males and females, which is the sweet spot for marketers, and 35 to 55-year-old females and males. with high and low sport backgrounds. And then, you know, I don't need to go into all the details, but essentially the protocol was to present them with 6 different images which were exemplars of how female athletes are represented in the media. We didn't make them up, we just gave them to them on a, you know, we randomly gave it to them, the 6 images, and we asked them to first just do free association, tell us what you think, how each one of these images makes you feel about women's sports. Second time through, and don't talk to your neighbor, these were focus groups in terms of audience reception research. Second time through, to get a quantitative piece, rate each one of these images on a 1 to 7 scale, Likert type scale, how much each one of these images makes you more likely to read about, watch, attend, buy a season ticket. And then the third phase of the protocol was open it up to discussion in terms of what did you write down in terms of free association, and then what ratings did you give. And what we found out, big surprise, was that both younger and older women were drawn to competence, images of athletic competence, and were offended by sexualized images, and older males essentially rated out like women. Now, the younger males did rate images of sexualized females as hot and did say they would be willing to buy the magazine, but when we said to them, but would you go to the event? And the response was no, because that's not what they look like playing basketball, or that's not what Danica Patrick looks like when she's driving a car. And so the sort of the key takeaway for me in this study was sex sells sex, not women's sports. So that's one study. But then, and this was related, and I very much agree with what Mike said earlier. I was very pleased to see the earlier media panel in terms of the kind of work that people are doing around audience. I mean, you're not calling it audience reception research, but it's essentially that. But I have to tell you, when I do my sort of slideshow, I get the most resistance that I get when I get resistance is from men, other than Mike Messner and Don Sabo, and elite female athletes who say, I'm proud of my body. I've worked really hard for my body. I like being portrayed in a well-rounded way. What's your problem? I think a lot of it's generational, okay? And one response is, you can show off your fabulously sculpted body that you've worked very hard for without lying on your back and, pardon my language, spreading your legs in Playboy magazine. That doesn't emphasize how athletically competent you are. It emphasizes how sexually accessible and vulnerable you are. But that's my interpretation. So the next study that I'm going to do is with Nicole Lavoie and Janet Fink at the University of Connecticut. We've already started some pilot stuff building on the Kane and Maxwell article, in which we're going to look at elite female scholarship athletes here and at the University of Connecticut in 3 individual versus 3 team sports, show them, again, these sort of exemplar images, and then say to them, how would you most like to be portrayed and why? How would your teammates most like to be portrayed and why? And which kinds of images do you think best represents women's sports, your sport, and creates interest in and respect for your sport? And I will be very interested to see what they say, because I don't know. And I think it might matter if you're in an individual or a team sport. And then just finally, I agree very much with Mike. I think we need to do much more around how these images are interpreted and contested by various audiences. And I think the tough one to get to is the production angle, because it's just so hard to get access to the people who produce it. You know, it's just really tough. But I certainly encourage people to do it if they can get that kind of access.
So is it okay if I go off script now? All right. So I think you might have already spoken to this, Mary Jo, but in sort of thinking about some of the conversations we've had today, and I don't know if it would be described or classified as maybe a post-feminist or a third-wave feminist perspective or critique, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about this notion that those images that we might classify as researchers as hypersexualized or hyperfeminine, those images are oftentimes interpreted by younger generations as empowering. I think there's a kind of a post-feminist or third wave critique that says or suggests that in some ways it's challenging the gender binary because it's disrupting that sort of linkage between muscularity and masculinity and femininity with passivity. And so when we see what we might term sexualized images on bodies, or sexualized images of athletic bodies, what does that do to potentially disrupt the gender binary, right? And so in some ways these might actually challenge that dichotomy. I know that argument exists out there, and I'm wondering if you can maybe respond to that critique of, or that response or argument or analysis that these images might actually be empowering or be read as not as oppressive or disempowering as maybe some of the scholarship would suggest. So.
Well, I think these images are absolutely contested in terms of how they're interpreted, which is why I want us to do this kind of research. But, one of my sort of standard stock lines to, I'm proud of my body, I like being portrayed naked in Playboy magazine, I've worked really hard, is what muscle group do bare breasts belong to? But it's tricky because then you're seen as somebody who's this, sort of feminazi, and you're uptight, and, you don't care about women's sports, and you're so old and, traditional, and, which is actually true. I don't know. It's a tough one because I don't think it's empowering at all. And one of the things I don't know, is John still out there somewhere, about the commentary on the Lingerie Football League. I have not ever listened to any of the commentary by the commentators doing play-by-play, but I can tell you how it is mocked and ridiculed when people bring it up, when men bring it up on the radio or on ESPN. Yeah. It's mocked and ridiculed. Sorry, John. So, do I think it's taken seriously? No. Do I think they're taken serious as athletes? Absolutely not. Do I think at the end of the day that those kinds of images make people look at them and go, wow, I have such enormous respect for women's sports? I don't believe it.
That's hard to follow up. But I think there is a generational difference here in this question, and I think part of it is that what's called a sort of second wave versus the third wave, I wouldn't call it even a theory, but more of a kind of sensibility of the world that roughly kind of maps onto just different generations, is that I think third wave feminism gets defined and expressed a lot more in an individual way, and second wave more in a collective way. And I think when we're thinking about whether something is good for women or not, and Gabrielle Reese or someone says, it's good for me and empowering for me to pose this way, when we say it's not, we're saying we're thinking collectively, is this good for girls and women? Mm-hmm. And I'd still argue that probably most of the time it's not. But the other thing I would want to say is that I think there is something very erotic, pleasurable, sexy about watching beautiful bodies move. And I love when I'm walking across my campus to stop by the track sometimes and watch the hurdlers practicing. It's just standing at ground level, and there's something very beautiful about it, and I would say in the broadest sense of the word, very erotic about it. And so we shouldn't be shy or embarrassed to talk about the pleasure of viewing beautiful bodies and beautiful bodies in motion. On the other hand, though, and I'll reiterate, somebody from the panel up here previously was quoting me saying something, so I'll reiterate that, which is that I think, we do see sexualized images of male athletes every so often. I mean, going way back to the 80s with Jim Palmer posing in skivvies, and everybody, ooh, he's so beautiful. And I think, you continue to see that to this day with different male athletes, sometimes in advertising and elsewhere. But that is against the backdrop of this incredible cacophony of images and discourse that's very respectful and celebratory about male athletes. So the occasional sexualization of male athletes is read and understood within the context of that broader, just mass of information, much of which is very respectful and celebratory. These images of women athletes that are sexualized, that really comes against the backdrop of silence most of the time. And so it becomes the most standout, salient images of women athletes. And when you think of little kids looking at that, boys and girls looking at that, I think that's where I find it very troubling. So if you had much more equitable, quantitative, and in terms of respectful coverage of women's sports, I doubt that we would be all that hot and bothered about a woman deciding to pose in a certain way, or a sexy ad with a female athlete in it. So context is so important, and I think we just need to continue to assert that. Partly, and I think there's a way that sort of observation might help us bridge that second and third wave feminist observation, because the third wave feminist sensibility oftentimes is to look at us second wavers as being stodgy about sex. They're the pro-sex generation. We are anti-sex. No, we're not. But we are very. And speaking as a generation, we have been very uncomfortable with the way women have been pigeonholed only oftentimes or mostly as sexual objects, and the disempowering aspects of that for girls and women in general are very disturbing.
Well, I've got it back here. Go ahead, Margaret.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is just a tiny addendum to what both Mary Jo and Mike said, which may or may not relate. The athletes, the female athletes who profess to be proud of their beautiful bodies, and I'm sure they are, may have also a financial motive for posing nude or practically nude. For example, well, this maybe that's not a good example, but it's very clear to me that athletes who are attractive and who sort of strut their stuff get a lot more media coverage and sponsorships. So there's that element too, and I think you have to kind of factor that in along with what Mike and Mary Jo were saying.
Well, I hate to interrupt generational sex talk at the end of the conference. Fascinating stuff. With an interest in time, let's open it up for some questions from the audience, because I'm guessing there are a few. So we'll start right here.
I just wanted to say thank you, because you guys are some of my idols as a new emerging scholar, and can only hope that I have an equally, prestigious career. But as an emerging scholar, one of the concerns that I have for myself is I'm on the border of sports sociology, so I'm either a sports scholar in a sociology department, or I'm a sociologist in a kinesiology department, right? And I think we're all kind of in that boat. So as our experts, how do you guys negotiate your position, and how have you done that in your careers?
I can handle that as a sociologist.
Yeah.
I'm in a sociology department, and I got my degree in sociology, and I have had a good number of sociology graduate students who do gender and sport work. And the way I have negotiated that myself, and the way I encourage my graduate students to negotiate that, is with the understanding that within the field of sociology, sport is still a very small subfield. When you look at the job ads, you don't see people advertising for sports sociologists in sociology departments. Very, very, very rarely. Every once in a while, yes, but very, very rarely. So if you're interested in media and sport and gender, or children and sport and gender, you situate your research primarily and foundationally in the sociology of gender, or the sociology of media, sociology of children, literature, and you use sport as your empirical entree into making a contribution in those subfields. And you can still be a member of North American Sociology for Sociology of Sport and be seen as a sports sociologist. We'll love you, you know. But strategically, you work in the field of sociology in areas that people are hiring in and that have well-established theoretical debates going on, and you bring sports sociology to them.
I just want to respond to something Margaret said about the corporate stuff at the end. Sorry. And that we need to factor that in. What I want to do at the very end of our study that Nicole and Janet Fink and I are doing is, once we've gotten the data that we need, is to say to these females, if you could get the same amount of media exposure and corporate sponsorship being portrayed as an on-court, highly competent, skilled, fabulous athlete, or an off-the-court sexualized portrayal, which would you choose? And I cannot wait to get the answer to that question.
It would.
Don't anybody else do this study.
Hi, it's been my observation in the last few years that the inclusion of women athletes in advertising on TV, that the percentage of women athletes has gone up significantly. Has there been any research on this? Has anybody else noticed this? Or, you know, it seems like especially young male athlete has almost disappeared from television advertising, and they're, you know, focusing on women. And most of it, you know, seems to be very positive. But I thought this was a good change that I've noticed.
I haven't noticed it.
I haven't noticed it.
I don't know. But just one thought on that is I have no idea, and I haven't noticed it, but is a really neat piece written a few years ago by Sarah Benet Weiser on the ways that black males in the NBA have been stigmatized, and to a certain extent, you know, you see less imagery of them in advertisements than you did maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and so maybe there's a bit of an opening there. And she compares the ways that the WNBA, as it was ascending, the women were kind of positioned as good women and not so troublesome as these black males. And so I think there's a sort of racial politic to some of the playing off of women athletes perhaps against black male athletes. I'm not sure if that's what's going on in what you're observing, though.
And Mary Jo, you talked about over here.
Sorry.
You
Lights are right in.
The lights right there.
you talked about Lisa Olson, and when I ever refer to that era, I talk about the Lisa Olson incident. But I'm wondering if it's problematic that we call it the Lisa Olson incident, or revealing that we call it that, as opposed to the New England Patriots incident, because it was really they were the actors, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Actually, that's a really good point. And had I thought about that when Lisa Dish and I were writing the article, I would have made that point. I was going to ask you, do you have any idea whatever happened to Lisa Olson? Do you know where she is?
She was back at the Boston Herald.
Yeah.
And that was the last that I had heard.
Yeah. No, you make an absolutely important point.
We have time for one more question.
Anyone that's a fan of Dancing with the Stars program? I've been troubled recently at what they're doing to Hope Solo.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how we react or what, but she came on as a strong female athlete. You could see her pride in herself and the way she handled herself. And then each week they chip away at her and they criticize her for her strength and her athleticism. And you can see it starting to change her so that she's starting to adopt some of that pole dancing that program has migrated into. And that's, I mean, that's the program. But somehow I feel as if one of our role models, a young woman who so many little girls look up to, has been put into a position, and she right now is somewhat helpless. I mean, you can almost see her at the end of the show hoping they're going to get voted off. It's almost like, oh no, I got to stay another week and go through this again. And she has a partner who's, you know, has to be the critical male in this situation. Has, I don't know where my question comes in all of this, but shouldn't we be very upset that one of our young women got put into that position and is now quite helpless to get herself out of it?
I don't watch Dancing with the Stars, so, but I know the point of it, I think. You know, I actually had a reporter who called me who was at Nike with Abby Wambach and Hope Solo, asking me what I thought about which direction they should sort of go, as if they had a choice. That's the first thing. And I always, again, to go back to my opening remarks about power and who benefits from certain kinds of portrayals, and I just think it's a classic example of taking an enormously gifted, powerful, prideful female athlete and completely sexualizing her, which in my view marginalizes and trivializes her. But it is an absolutely contested position with younger women. Female student athletes in my classes disagree with me, Dorothy, a lot. So, you know, I don't know what you do.
You do a study, and this is I don't watch it either. I don't watch it either, but you could do, yeah, that's a good idea. You could do a case study of that, you know, and if you could get to the production end, great, but you could analyze the show during the stretch of time that she's on, and then you could do audience research while you're doing that to find out how it is that different people have different views on that, and how their social situations lead them to have different views of that. So there's so many of those things out there we can study.
Yes.
Let's give this panel a round of applause. Wow. And the moderator. What a treat to be able to sit back and listen to you reflect on your careers and your impact of your research. It was really fun. What a way to end the day. So I'll invite you guys to step down at the moment, if you will. And we're going to wrap this up in the words of Mary Jo Kane. We're going to keep this simple. And we're going to create some strategies for change very quickly, because I know we've had a long day, and I know people have places to go. So hang with me. 2 minutes, 1 minute. So one concrete strategy of change at your table. We'll take about 3 minutes. We've talked about a lot of things. We're going to put up the master wordle up on the master out of all the chime-ins. It's coming up. So while we're doing that, a couple strategies for change. We'll see what we have, then we'll wrap it up. Hey, Jen, can you take notes for me on these strategies? When people come up with them. Oh, we can. Yeah. I can take notes. No, that's good as well. Do it on the chime. Nice to meet you. Thank you, Margaret. That was really fun.
It's my pleasure.
It's neat.
Enjoyed.
Yeah.
It was fun to hear from Mary Jo and Mike and to see some of our thoughts sort of ran in the same
Yeah.
direction.
Austin, do you want to clear the chime in? Yeah. All right, when you're talking about your strategy for change, if you come up with one already, type it into the chime in. Let's see what we have. Do you have it, Mary Beth? You're not. Is that one? It should be loaded. Thanks, Mary Jo. Nice job. Nice job. Yeah. Nice job. Okay, the chime in's open. If you can't chime in, that's okay. We've got Post-it notes as well. So what do you guys have over here?
We were just trying to figure out how to build a little bridge between the research and the people that are actually working with those different groups. Like, how can we take what's being done research-wise and use it?
Get it to the people that
can use it.
that need it the most.
And put it in a forum that they can use it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
People that are there that are receiving it are also scholars, and if an athletics person walks into the room, even just the discourse is overwhelming to them, and they feel alienated and probably tend to like back their way.
Accessible. You guys have a good strategy here? Good. Good. So put your strategies in time out. Chime in. You're good. All right. Do you submit it? All right. No, I'm just listening.
This is our. Talk about it. Talk about the implications so you have the data.
Where? How?
Yeah, we're talking about that. We have lots of ideas.
Good. Put it in there. Really focus your energy on concrete strategies. What can we do? So if I looked at you and said, how do you do that? You could tell me. Good, all right? You're not chiming. It's not chiming, okay. Can you type in there, chime? They're not chimed in. Are you guys chimed in? You got your strategies? You chimed? Good, all right. Okay, the chimes are coming in.
Okay, maybe it is. Oh, I'm sorry.
You guys, you chiming? All right. Oh. What do you guys got over here? I expect big things if your brain's not baked. I know. It's a little scary, isn't it? No. Okay, I'm going to walk around here. The chimes are up. If you can see that, it's kind of an eye test, really. I'm going to just sample a few tables here. You're going to tell us what your strategies for change are. And I'm guessing some are similar. So I'm going to start with, we're going to go to Judy. All right. All right, Judy, start us off.
I think we may not have followed the directions precisely. However, we feel really strongly that there's so much positive energy in this room, and we're concerned about people going home after this conference, and that we need to identify partnerships, and we need to make sure that there's follow-up, and that the practitioners have access to the research, and the researchers have access to what those of us in the arena or the playing fields are hearing from those that are experiencing whatever inequities they might be experiencing or lack of support or whatever. But there's really strength in numbers, and so our constructive suggestion is to identify a way that we can continue this positive energy collectively.
Is that close? That's great. And I'm hoping one of my goals of this is to continue this conversation online through social media, our Facebook, our Twitter feeds, our chime-in clouds, and that we can continue this dialogue. Now, I'm coming back to the Mankato group back here because I think they might have another add-on to how we can bridge this gap between scholars and practitioners. Sindra? Sindra's going to fix it for us.
We talked about, actually what I'm including right now is using our research to make a real world difference. So we talked about being a public scholar, and we talked about when we do research, getting it out there for the public and using words that people understand. So what the panel just said and what the panelists said about Mike Messner and Mike Messner's work. We also talked about doing programs in our community. So our group is from Mankato, which is about an hour and a half south. And we talked about real programs that we can implement there for low-income girls and how to incorporate sport within that. So we have lots of ideas, but which is a awesome thing. But our real kind of conclusion is to use our research to make real world differences.
And I'm going to ask you how you're going to measure that. You can think about that. All right, I'm coming over to the sport media female athlete representation group because I know you guys have some good thoughts.
Good evening. We also, as many other groups, talked about the real-world application of scholarship, and what we talked specifically about was media literacy and increasing media literacy. And we find it to be a little bit late sometimes to address that on a college level. And so we were talking about trying to find a way to reach parents and educate them about how they can teach their children to critically look at media images as early as maybe 5th or 6th grade. So in a way, giving an opportunity for children to grow up questioning these images instead of internalizing them and getting to the age when they're in college and they become resistant to the thought that there is something wrong with these images. So trying to find a way to reach a larger demographic than just college students.
No? All right, who else has a good one they want to share? Okay, coming over there. The thing The thing with a conference like this, you generate a lot of ideas, and then as Judy said, you walk out the door and like, oh, there's so much great energy, and then it's like, So I'm trying to get us to focus on what are you going to do? Not what you're going to think about, but what are you going to do? So if I ask you a year from now, remember that conference? What did you do? And you look at me and go, it was, yeah. Okay, go.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. But a couple things. Exposure and education to families where their children, girls who have been previously not well represented in sports, such as low SES groups, African American, Hispanic, et cetera, all the other groups that we were talking about today. Exposure and education to those families, as well as making sports low cost. That's one thing that hasn't really been addressed that much, is sports is expensive, and only the privileged get to do sports. So making sports low cost or free would be great. I don't know how to do that, but that's my idea.
One of the things that we talked about at this table as a concrete strategy was formulating partnerships that actually result in applied work. So using evidence-based techniques to make sure that everything we do is informed, but just really working with people, with Girl Scouts, with local YWCAs, with Boys and Girls Clubs, with, programs to make, to help create change and just bring to life some of this evidence that we use so that we can all do our jobs a little bit differently when we show up tomorrow.
Like I said before, I'm in the cycling industry, and somehow managed to sneak into this wonderful academic conference entirely undetected. But one thing I'm really going to take away from this is that there is evidence. So next time someone says to me, hey, Emma, what do you suggest for our next ad campaign for some merchandising in the store to sell more women's product? And I say, well, let's not make it about sex. And they're like, well, Emma, sex sells. And I can be like, no, actually, it doesn't. And here are the studies that show that it doesn't, because that's what a lot of people in the sports industries, or at least the ones that I'm familiar with, respond to. And knowing that there is the research that backs that up and that I can find that if I need to, and having all of you do that research and continue to do that research and disprove myths like that is awesome and will create solid change over time.
Let's hear from two more. I'm sneaking back here. You guys have one back here? Yes?
We had kind of an interesting discussion back here regarding like the development of identity and feminism, but I think going along with that is kind of don't be afraid to call yourself a feminist, and more specifically, kind of the discussion that I was thinking of is that we should all go out from here and go online and find one organization that we want to volunteer or financially support if you have the means. Find one organization that supports women's sports and put your money where your mouth is, or your body where your mouth is, and go out there and do something. Find an organization that you can volunteer with, be involved.
Well said. Okay. Over here.
It makes me feel awesome hearing everyone talk about how they would like to help an organization that's doing something with younger girls, because we have one. It happens to be in San Francisco at the moment, but it's in the really, really early stages. It's a girls' sports camp that also does health, leadership, and social justice workshops, and it's for girls from 6 to 12. So right before the major self-esteem drop, we're trying to preemptively do something about that. So I would love to hand out my business card. We need all kinds of advice, networking opportunities, anything. We're really, really young right now, but that would be awesome. The acronym is GIRL, it stands for Girls Reclaiming Revolutionary Recreational Learning. So it's kind of a Riot Girl reference for anybody who gets that.
You always have to plug your organization. That's good. All right, one more. Who's got a good one? Something different? Looking? No? Okay. Well, here's My challenge to all of us, a lot of good ideas, a lot of good thinking, hopefully many good partnerships that will grow out of this. My challenge to you is we have all your emails. I'm going to email you in a year from now. And I'm going to ask you personally, what did you do as a result of this conference? And I know everybody is going to email me back with small or big, little, gigantic, huge, national, international, local, grassroots. It doesn't matter what level we're talking about, but something concrete, okay? My other invitation is we'll be sending out some links to all this media that you see around you. If you're wondering, like, well, how do I get that word cloud, and where did it go, and how can I get it? Austin will make sure that everybody has access to what we've been doing together today, because this reflects all of our work and our thinking. And I know I'm exhausted. How about you, mentally? It's been a long day. I want to thank you all so much for coming here and sharing this space and your time and effort with us. And I invite you to continue your conversations. We kind of have to eventually mosey out of here, but don't feel like you have to sprint out the door. And please keep in touch with us. If you wanted to connect with someone and you didn't, and you don't have their email or their card, let us know, and we'll connect you, all right? So thank you, thank you, thank you, and I look forward to hearing a year from now what you're up to. Travel safe. Have a good rest of your evening. Please help yourself to the pens, the pads of paper. Leave your name tags on the way out. Leave